Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm going to be reviewing 3 books spanning 2 different series that are both inspired by Russian history. So first I'm going to be doing what's basically going to be a full series review of the Waning Moon Duology by Leena Likitalo. The first book of these is The 5 Daughters of the Moon, and the second is The Sisters of the Crescent Empress. This was released back in July, I think, and this one came out in November. And then I'm going to be talking about The Girl in the Tower by Katherine Arden, which is the sequel to The Bear and the Nightingale, out earlier this month in the US, next month in the UK. Now, I try to keep series reviews and reviews of sequels relatively spoil-free, but in case you want to avoid all knowledge of what happens later in a series, I'm going to be starting off just talking about The 5 Daughters of the Moon before I talk about the sequel, Sisters of the Crescent Empress, and then I'm going to be talking about The Girl in the Tower at the end of the video last. So, The 5 Daughters of the Moon is admittedly a kind of rough opening to what I consider to be a really strong duology overall. This belongs to the category of sort of pseudo-historical fantasy, where fictional settings and characters are based on real-life people, places, and events, in this case, the Russian Revolution and the Romanov siblings, but it's not actually our world or any modified alternate version thereof. In what I consider a successful feat of world-building, the fantastical elements in this story serve to highlight themes that come from the historical source, even when they cause the story to go down its own path. So in this world, the Crescent Empire is ruled by a royal matriarchy in which the Crescent Empress is symbolically / religiously / magically married to the moon, which occupies the role of a god. Though each of her daughters has a human biological father, they are considered the daughters of the moon, and they refer to the moon as their papa. The Crescent Empress never seems to bear sons, which seems to be one of the many elements of the magic in this world that go unexplained. A lot of the atmosphere of Likitalo's story comes from the strange incomprehensibility of the magic, which pervades this first book without really ever taking center stage or being thoroughly examined. So, as a reviewer, you may have noticed this about me or you may not have, I very rarely criticize the pacing of a book. It's not a term I throw around a lot when I talk about things I've read. It's a vague enough term that I'm not always sure exactly what reviewers mean when they use it. But my main issue with this book is one that I am comfortable identifying as a pacing problem. In a valiant attempt to give all 5 of her protagonists equal page time, the author uses a strict narrative structure where she gives them each a chapter in turn in order from youngest to oldest. There are 2 rounds of these chapters in the first book, giving us 10 chapters total, with a sort of sense that it's split down the middle between the introductory chapters of the characters and then their second chapters. And that's a division that is also marked by a significant shift in the plot. In contrast, The Sisters of the Crescent Empress has 3 rounds of chapters for each character, and that's why it's a longer book. My frustration with this structure in The 5 Daughters of the Moon is that it gives us a pretty poor idea of what's actually happening in the story until Celestia, the oldest daughter and heir to the throne of the Crescent Empire, gets her first point of view chapter in the middle of the book, at which point it was essentially too late for me. I wanted to already have an idea of what was going on. Basically, what is going on in this book is that the influential Goodreads Protslav has invented a great thinking machine that's supposed to solve the Empire's economic strife and disparity with its superior reasoning. The Goodreads in this being religious figures with magical abilities, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that fictional word correctly. But in this world, magic is powered by extracted animal souls, and the souls that the great thinking machine requires are human. This book, it turns out, is all about a coup in which Georgy Pratslav rallies popular discontent for his own benefit, since the Crescent Empress has rejected his machine, while magically manipulating Celestia and using her as a pawn in his schemes. But it really did take way too long to figure that out, given how short the book is. We get some of the pieces of this puzzle in jumbled bits from the perspectives of some of the younger girls, but while the introductions of all of the characters are necessary, they don't all yet carry equal weight in the story. Apart from Celestia, who has the greatest political understanding of events, Leena, the youngest, has the greatest magical understanding, though the things she sees are thought to be symptoms of illness. She's usually drugged, never believed, and has learned to keep what she perceives to herself. The concerns of the middle sisters, who are Mariel, Sibylla, and Elise, are more mundane, and their narrative voices felt stiff and forced to me at the beginning of the book. That is, by the way, a problem I didn't have at all in book 2, where each of them has a more vital and less stereotypical role to play. Mariel is a stubborn and naive young troublemaker, and both Sibylla and Elise are unwisely boy-crazy, but to vastly different effect. But I kept feeling like I was being dragged away from whatever was just starting to get interesting to go meet another protagonist. And I did wish that the author had allowed for a more natural rhythm in those switches between characters. By the time the daughters get their second chapters, however, they are all essentially in the same place at the same time, experiencing basically the same sequence of events. And so the narrative structure stopped feeling so disjointed for me at that point. Now, I wouldn't think twice about a meandering introduction this long in a full-length novel, but in this case, that introduction was a full half of the page count. And after that, the second half of the book builds up towards a finale that turns out to be really anticlimactic if you're actually thinking of it as a book's finale. So I really do think that this first book in the duology would have been better as an opening salvo to a longer novel. A novel, say, this long. I suppose it's possible that this story might have been a harder sell as a book of this length, but I worry that readers frustrated with book 1 will give up and miss out on the rewards of the sequel. The Sisters of the Crescent Empress is deeply character-driven, and it's where the Waning Moon duology really finds its strength. This is the book where each of the 5 protagonists come into their own under the most trying of circumstances. The Daughters of the Moon arrive at an isolated house in the far north of the Empire, where they are held prisoner, and their distrust of each other begins to fester with the secrets that they each keep. For example, unbeknownst to the others, Celestia is harboring the soul of a swan within her own. She's also suffering the damage of the things Georgy Pratslav has done to her, and her careful planning seems increasingly futile. Elise, previously an idealistic supporter of the rebellion in secret, is at an ideological standoff with her older sister, and their growing misunderstanding of each other's motives is intentionally frustrating. Sibylla, whose chapters are told in both books in the form of diary entries, emerges as a central character, as she teaches herself magic from mysterious runes in the scriptures that only reveal themselves to a few. Mariel is increasingly frustrated with being treated as a child, unworthy of having things explained to her, and when she acts on incomplete information, she puts everyone in peril. And then there are the things that Leena has been seeing in the shadows all along, which may be divinations of her sister's destinies, but they are not to be understood until it is too late. And on top of all that, this house they are trapped in turns out to be haunted. The ghosts hold grudges and reveal themselves only to the youngest daughters. It's clear to the reader that these ghosts, Irina and Elysia, are their mother's sisters, and their presence in this desolate and lonely place sheds a dark light on what it can mean to be a sister of the Crescent Empress, even should Celestia manage to reclaim her throne as she plans to. This is an intimate and claustrophobic story about 5 girls who are central to the fate of an empire in the throes of a civil war. But they are receiving no news of outside events except for a bit of blatant propaganda, and they're left to speculate on what has come to pass since the Gagarji's attempt to seize power. Like the politics, the magic in this story continues to be elusive and compelling. You get the sense that there's a lot to it that you just don't get to see. There's a witch with unclear intentions, but an interest in the daughters, a complicated system of casting mind control spells that is never thoroughly explained, and last but not least, the incomprehensible will of their father, the moon himself. I found myself becoming increasingly nervous as the ending approached. Our daughters are based on the Romanovs, and we know how that story ends. On the one hand, I would have never accepted a wildly revisionist, victorious conclusion to their stories. But on the other hand, you simply cannot kill off all 5 of your protagonists and expect your readers to still like you afterwards. I think Likitalo strikes a pretty good balancing act here, delivering both tragedy and a bit of hope. The conclusion is heartbreaking and stuck with me long after I put the book aside. Don't expect the fate of the Crescent Empire to be resolved here, or even the fates of all of the daughters. There are definitely still battles to be fought, but it's unquestionably the right ending for this story. So I gave the 5 Daughters of the Moon 3 stars. I gave the Sisters of the Crescent Empress 4 stars. If they had been one book, it would have solved most of the problems that I had with this one, and it would have been a solid 4-star read for me. So, on to The Girl in the Tower. Interesting point of comparison here. I thought that The Bear and the Nightingale really could have worked as an open-ended standalone. I do like slightly open-ended conclusions like this one, where things aren't necessarily all wrapped up with a neat little bow. And so I don't demand sequels when books I like end this way. However, sometimes they are meant to be expanded into a series, and The Girl in the Tower marks a shift to what is now looking like a pretty clearly defined fantasy trilogy. The series title is now, I think, the Winter Night Trilogy. And there are some shifts in storytelling that happen here as a result. The Bear and the Nightingale was a slow story told over a span of years, set in the cold and isolated north of Rus, or medieval Russia. We watched young Vasilisa grow from birth to become a beguiling young woman, in tune with the magic that is fading from her land. This second book picks up where the first left off, but it's more of a fast-paced, plot-driven adventure story, with Vasya masquerading as a young nobleman. Determined to see the world, she strikes out alone with her magical horse, but eventually finds herself propelled into the orbit of her beloved brother Alexander, who's become a renowned monk, and her sister Olga, who is now a noblewoman in Moscow following her marriage years before. Their world is a political one in which actions have consequences that Vasya has little understanding of, as she unwittingly puts them both in great danger with her deception, as Vasily Petrovich, as she calls herself as a boy, finds favor with the Grand Prince of Moscow, who is a good friend of her brother. As with the first book, the backdrop of the second is a medieval Russia, where Russian principalities are chafing under the yoke of Mongol infidel rule, in quotes. But while that conflict is distant backdrop for the first book, it becomes immediate in The Girl in the Tower, with the Grand Prince's desire to wage a fight for independence complicated by the threat of bandits that are pillaging Russian towns. So in addition to the adventure story, there's an element of political scheming and intrigue that feels much more like rote historical fiction and fantasy fare than anything in The Bear and the Nightingale really did. Additionally, this sort of predictable fantasy romance that I was kind of relieved didn't happen in book 1 does materialize in book 2, But I found that I wasn't actually all that pissed about it because I thought that Arden handled it with plenty of finesse. The most compelling relationships in this book are the sibling relationships. And both Olga and Alexander are given strong character development, with the opening chapters dedicated to establishing their place in the story even before Vasya arrives on the scene. Vasilisa and Alexander seem to be cut from the same cloth, but he is a man of God while she is a woman of the older pre-Christian ways. So does this mean that he must denounce her as a witch even when he sees so much of himself in her? Meanwhile, Olga lives a life that is foreign and incomprehensible to wild Vasya. At this time in Russian history, noble women were expected to live in secluded households like the Tower of the Title, and basically not interact with the outside world at all. Olga is comfortable within her own sphere of influence, but one of her young daughters might not be cut out for it any more than Vasya is. What does remain constant from book one is Arden's rich use of Russian fairy tales, her portrait of the contentious coexistence between old and new beliefs, and her ability to weave the magical into a story that is deeply rooted in history. The Girl in the Tower introduces even more characters and story elements from traditional Russian fairy tales. And like the first book, it starts out with a telling of a traditional tale, in this case, The Snow Maiden, that introduces themes that recur throughout the book. Arden's writing style continues to be evocative and atmospheric, but this book relies more heavily on tried and true fantasy adventure tropes than her first novel did. So I'm not sure I would recommend The Girl in the Tower as strongly on its literary merit as I did The Bear and the Nightingale back when it was released, but I certainly enjoyed the ride just as much, if not more. And I gave it 4 stars, which is the same rating that I gave the first book. I would say that if you are a seasonal reader, I feel like Russian-inspired fantasy is good for the winter. I'm not a particularly seasonal reader. But if you're looking to pick up something this winter with, like, atmospheric, cold, magical settings, I think either these books or the Winter Night trilogy would probably do it for you. Anyhow, let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you're planning to, let me know what you think. I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.